Have you guys heard of misattribution of arousal? No? Has any of you heard of arousal? Of course you have. You're watching me online. Nothing more arousing than Sam Vaknin, the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and on top of that, a professor of psychology roving in the wilds of Paris. Today we're going to discuss the connection between anxiety and sexual arousal. Now, on the face of it, anxiety is the opposite of sexual arousal. Who can think of sex when they're anxious? And vice versa. When you are in the throes of orgasmic sex, the last thing on your mind is anxiety. But that would be completely wrong. Anxiety can be misidentified, misattributed as sexual arousal. Very often, we feel anxiety, but we don't realize it's anxiety. There's a general malaise, a general sense of discomfort, an ominous undertone, something in the offing, in the horizon, a threat that is diffuse and ambient. We can't place our finger on it. This is known as generalized or diffused anxiety. It's a very common condition. In healthy people, it's temporary and transient. In people with anxiety disorders, it's everlasting. It's constantly there. But this type of anxiety is often ignored, denied. It does not garner the attention it deserves. It's not labeled properly. And then it can be misidentified as sexual arousal. It can be eroticized. So the person with this kind of anxiety might say, I'm actually sexually aroused by this or that person, or by the circumstances, or by this porn movie that I'm watching. I'm sexually aroused, when in reality what's happening is there's an underlying anxiety. And this is what is known as misattribution of arousal, when one affect or one state of mind is misidentified as sexual arousal. But it goes both ways. If you're in the habit of misidentifying your identity as sexual arousal, you would also tend to misidentify your sexual arousal as anxiety. Whenever you're sexually aroused, you would feel for some reason anxious, as if something really bad is going to happen. Some premonition, some anticipation of a catastrophe. You would catastrophize sexual arousal, and in this sense, sexual arousal can be anxiogenic, can be misidentified as anxiety, and this misidentification would lead to the emergence of real anxiety. Sexual arousal can bring on anxiety exactly the way that anxiety can be misidentified as sexual arousal. It goes both ways. But sex can be anxiolytic. Sex has the capacity to reduce anxiety. And so this creates a hall of mirrors. The initial diffuse generalized anxiety is misattributed to sexual arousal. You misidentify your anxiety. You say, I'm actually sexually aroused. Let me have sex. And then you have sex, and your anxiety is gone. It's anxiolytic. So this leads you to believe that your initial identification of the situation as sexual arousal has been correct. That there has been no involvement of anxiety. So the anxiety remains hidden, remains occult, remains behind the scenes, because sexual arousal often leads to actual acts of sex, including masturbation. Doesn't have to be sex with someone else. So the sequence is anxiety, disguised, camouflaged as sexual arousal, sex or sex act that reduces the anxiety to the point that it vanishes, and then you're able to say, this has all been about sex. This has all been about sexual arousal that has led to sex. There was no anxiety involved, which of course is wrong. Even gender roles are connected to anxiety. We know that gender roles are performative. And they're intimately connected through sexual scripts to the sex act and to sexual arousal. So even gender roles are connected to anxiety. In some situations, masculinity is anxiogenic. Masculinity induces anxiety via the expression, verbalization, or externalization of aggression. Aggression is often identified with masculinity, so masculinity brings on anxiety. Femininity in these conditions is anxiolytic. It reduces the anxiety. There are other situations where it's exactly the opposite. The feminine side or femininity generates anxiety, and it takes masculinity to calm the situation down, to reduce the anxiety. So, but be that as it may, and again, it depends crucially on the circumstances, on the environment, on other people, and so on. But be that as it may, gender roles are always associated with anxiety. There's anxiety communicated, anxiety generated, and anxiety reduced and ameliorated. What about the narcissist? The narcissist is sexually attracted to himself or herself. The narcissist has auto-arousal, auto-erotism. The narcissist is aroused by himself or herself. And this translates to diffuse generalized anxiety. In case of misattribution of arousal, when the narcissist gets aroused, it creates anxiety. So the narcissist's autoerotic impulses, the narcissist's sexual attraction to himself or to herself, would go hand in hand with a general atmosphere of diffuse anxiety, with a general ambience of anxiety, with masturbation as the only anxiolysis. Masturbation is the only act able to reduce the anxiety, to diffuse it. And the connection between anxiety and sexual arousal is one example of misattribution of arousal. It's when people mistakenly assume that whatever is happening to them is causing them to feel aroused. People find themselves in various situations, and they have physiological changes, they have emotional changes, they have even cognitive processes going on. They can't explain these things, and then they say, well, I must be sexually aroused. And that is the misattribution of arousal, this process of misidentification. When people actually experience physiological responses related, for example, to fear or to exertion, people mislabel these responses as romantic arousal. Physiological symptoms may be attributed to incorrect stimuli because many stimuli have similar physiological symptoms and background. So when your blood pressure shoots up, when you experience shortness of breath, when your heart rate climbs, when all these changes happen, they can be attributed either to some physiological condition, underlying physiological condition, tachycardia is one example, or they can be attributed to some psychological process, emotional dysregulation, some being overwhelmed by arousal, and so on. So people often conflate the two. When they have physiological things happening, they misattribute them to some emotional state, and they misidentify physiological arousal with mental arousal, especially sexual arousal. One of the initial studies that looked into this phenomenon was conducted by Schachter and Singer in 1962. It was based on the idea that the experience of arousal could be ambiguous and therefore misattributed to an incorrect stimulus. So the researchers developed what came to be known as a two-factor theory of emotion. And misattribution of arousal is an influence on emotion processing. It's like an interruption in the transition between factor 1 to factor 2 in the generation of an emotion. And misidentification or misattribution of arousal is common in situations which are unusual. I mentioned, for example, exertion. I mentioned physiological, medical conditions such as tachycardia, but also in dating, romantic situations, exercise. In all these conditions where the body's physiological equilibrium and homeostasis is impacted, it is easy to misidentify these physiological changes as if they're emanating from some external stimulus, for example, an attractive woman. The possible effects of misattribution of arousal is numerous. One of the most famous is when you perceive a potential partner as more attractive than he or she is because of a heightened state of physiological stress. And this is also common with alcohol, but consumption of alcohol has an direct impact on certain structures in the brain. So alcohol doesn't cause a misattribution of arousal. There's a study by White and others in 1981 investigated this phenomenon and found that people in an unrelated aroused state will rate an attractive woman or man more highly than others who are not aroused. So you could be aroused by something completely unrelated. You just climbed stairs, many stairs, or you exerted yourself somehow, you exercised, or you consumed a lot of heavy food, so you're aroused in the physiological sense, or you're even aroused in the mental sense. You've had a fight with someone, or whatever. And this state of arousal, which has nothing to do with sexuality, nothing to do with sex, nothing to do with romance, nothing to do with intimacy, is misattributed. And you're going to say, wow, this person is so attractive, so drop-dead gorgeous, I wish I could have sex with her. And the sexual arousal is a secondary derivative phenomenon which is intended to disguise and camouflage the real sources of arousal. For example, the fear. You could therefore say that misattribution of arousal is an attempt to reduce anxiety by converting it into something pleasurable and also socially acceptable. So there is an attempt to sublimate negative effects such as fear or physiological situations which are potentially threatening, like an increase in heart rate or increase in blood pressure. There's an attempt to exit this environment of threat, this environment of fear, this environment of effort and stress, and to convert all these into a type of arousal that is rewarding and pleasurable, dopaminergic, and sought after, and socially acceptable. It's a recasting or reframing that is done unconsciously by the body itself. It's like the body says, you're afraid now. To be afraid is not pleasant. I don't want to be afraid. I'm anxious about being afraid. So I will not call it fear. I will call it sexual arousal. Okay, so I'm sexually aroused. But to whom? Who is the one who is sexually attractive? Ah, this woman. Ah, this man. So it's the attraction that's there, not the specific attractive person. The researchers in White also found that people who are aroused would dislike an unattractive person more than those without arousal. So it goes both ways, because there's a desperate need to justify the lie, the self-deception that it's sexual arousal. You need to be in the presence of attractive people in order to explain to yourself why you are sexually aroused. So the sequence is this. There's fear or unpleasant emotion, negative affect, some physiological threatening state of the body. You convert it into the belief or into the misattribution, into the self-deception. You lie to yourself that you're actually being sexually aroused, but it's very difficult to lie to yourself if you're surrounded by unattractive people. And so you would resent the presence of unattractive people. You would be angry at them. and you would dislike them. And this is exactly what we found in studies. The mistaken attribution of a fast heart rate, tachycardia, for sexual arousal is a recognized phenomenon in psychology. So many emotional states create, as I said, similar physiological responses. So it's easy to confuse them. If you rely only on your physiological responses as an indicator, if the only way you can identify emotions and label them is by listening to your body, you're in trouble. Because the multiplicity of emotional states and affects and so on and cognitions produce the same physiological symptoms and signs, and it's very difficult to tell them apart. So this kind of person would misinterpret an accelerated heart rate caused by one stimulus, like fear, anxiety, exercise, exertion, as sexual attraction towards another person. The misinterpretation, as I said, is based on what came to be known as the two-factor theory of emotion. The theory states that an emotional experience is composed of two parts: physiological arousal, physical reaction of some kind, like a change in heart rate or blood pressure or vasodilation or any change in a physiological parameter, followed by a cognitive label. Cognitive label is when the brain is trying to interpret what is the physical reaction based on? What's the context of the physiological reaction? Like the brain spots the physiological reaction and asks itself, why is this happening to me? And then it's easy to get a wrong answer. It's easy to cognitively mislabel the emotion and say, well, I'm actually sexually aroused, or I'm romantically aroused, I'm falling in love, I'm getting infatuated, or state of limerence, and so on. If a person experiences a fast heart rate, which is physiological arousal, and that person attributes it to the person they're with, rather than the true cause, that kind of misattribution could lead to very problematic outcomes and untoward consequences. If you're in a stressful or anxiety-inducing situation, and instead of labeling it correctly, coping with the underlying problems that have yielded it, avoiding the catastrophizing, reducing, ameliorating, mitigating the anxiety somehow, maybe even with medication, if you deny the anxiety completely, repress it, relabel it wrongly, reframe it, and say, no, I'm not anxious, I'm sexually attracted, I'm sexually aroused, I'm romantically attracted to this person, this could lead to modes of sexual behavior and romantic behavior which are highly compulsive, coercive, and potentially illegal. Because if the only way for you to reduce your anxiety, the only anxiolysis, the only anxiolytic method is to fall in love with someone or to have sex with someone, to get infatuated with someone, you would develop a stockish personality. You would become very creepy because it's the only way for you to feel at ease, calm, and composed and restored somehow. Many medical conditions cause misattribution. It's a widespread problem. Inappropriate sinus tachycardia, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, ventricular tachycardia, all of them have been associated with, or connected to misattribution of arousal. So how would you know if your arousal is real, or at the very least normal? How would you know that your arousal is not a constant state of disguising anxiety? How could you tell? Well, you need to monitor your body. You need to talk to your body, and you need to get to know your body really, really well. Take, for example, tachycardia. If your rapid heartbeat occurs without any physical or emotional trigger, no clear cause, if the symptoms are persistent, the fast heart rate lasts for an unusual duration or continues long after some kind of excitement or exertion has subsided. If other symptoms are present, the tachycardia is accompanied by other signs such as dizziness, shortness of breath, fatigue, if this creates distress and fear, anxiety, avoidance of actually sexual activity, and so on and so forth, we are probably talking about a physiological state. If you experience a rapid heartbeat time and again, it can't be that you are attracted to people time and again. It's probably something medical. You need to look into it. Sexual arousal is more rare than you know. Romantic arousal is even rarer. So if this happens to you like 20 times a day, every time your heartbeat goes up or your blood pressure goes up or whatever, or you become dizzy or fatigued, exerted, and you constantly convert it into sexual arousal, then what you're doing is you're just disguising the underlying medical condition. Now, I'd like to review a few of the studies and experiments conducted, starting by the seminal study, Dutton and Aaron, study titled Some Evidence for Heightened Sexual Attraction Under Conditions of High Anxiety, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The study showed that the study was conducted on male participants with female confederates, female collaborators. So more males contacted the female experimenter when they had just walked down a suspension bridge. So there was a female confederate at the end of a suspension bridge. And that female confederate was willing and able to give out her phone number. When men crossed the suspension bridge, they tended to ask for the phone number in much higher numbers when they crossed a regular sturdy bridge. The suspension bridge created suspense, created fear, created anxiety, which were then misinterpreted as sexual arousal, and the men asked for the phone number much more often than men who crossed a normal regular bridge, because these men who crossed the suspension bridge misattributed their arousal. They believed that they were feeling sexual arousal at the sight of the female, instead of feeling the leftover physiological arousal from the fear of walking across the suspension bridge. The researchers said that men found the women more attractive when they had more anxiety about crossing the bridge. A bridge that induced anxiety also created a misattribution of arousal, and the men asked for the phone number of the female confederate. A bridge that did not create anxiety, because it was not swaying with the winds, did not create anxiety, the men did not ask for the phone number or ask for it rarely. There were no significant differences on either bridge when the researchers used a male confederate instead of a female confederate. So clearly the misinterpreted arousal was sexual in nature. We already mentioned Schachter and Singer's 1962 study titled Cognitive, Social, and Physiological Determinants of Emotional State in Psychological Review. And they found that if someone was physiologically aroused without being aware of it, they would attribute their arousal to a recent thought in their memory. So it's not always converted into sexual arousal. Sometimes the brain desperately tries to connect a state of anxiety or physiological arousal to the most recent thought or the most recent memory or even the most recent emotion. Researchers also found that emotions, in this particular study, they focused on euphoria and anger. They found that emotions could be manipulated by providing a participant with a shot of epinephrine, and so adrenaline. So when they injected adrenaline, there was arousal, physiological arousal, which was immediately misinterpreted as either anger or euphoria. And whether the arousal was labeled anger or labeled euphoria could be influenced by other people. It's pretty shocking. There was a determination of the emotional state from the outside on condition that an underlying physiological arousal state was present. Another study by Savitsky, Medved, Charlton, Gilovich, and others, titled in 1998, was titled "What? Me? Worry? Arousal, Misattribution, and the Effect of Temporal Distance on Confidence," was published in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. They discovered that misattribution of arousal can also influence how much confidence one feels before completing a task. The famous study by White, Fishbein, Rutstein, and others, titled "Passionate Love and the Misattribution of Arousal," was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and it found that regardless of the stimulus polarity, if the stimulus was positive, stimulus was negative, stimulus was neutral, didn't matter. Regardless of the polarity, the participants in the aroused state found the attractive Confederate woman more attractive and the unattractive Confederate woman as less attractive than the unaroused participants. So the unaroused participants were closer to the truth in judging attractiveness, whereas the aroused participants exaggerated the attractiveness and exaggerated the unattractiveness, regardless of whether the stimulus that had created the physiological arousal was neutral, positive, or negative. Loftis and Ross in November 1974 wrote the article "Effects of Misattribution of Arousal upon the Acquisition and Extinction of a Conditioned Emotional Response." It was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and they suggested that misattribution procedures can change physiological response to a conditioned source of fear or arousal. In other words, as I said earlier in this video, misattribution changes the relationship, the interaction, the response to a conditioned source of fear and arousal. Self-perception and attribution played a major role in emotional response. And finally, I would like to discuss a study by Allen, Kendrick, Linda, McCall, and others, 1989, titled "Arousal and Attraction, a Response Facilitation Alternative to Misattribution and Negative Reinforcement Models." It's a study that kind of revolutionized the field. You will understand in a minute why. So, all the previous studies and the two-factor model of emotions and so on, they all said that you need to be unaware of the true cause of the arousal in order to misattribute it. Misattribution of arousal is because we don't know why the arousal is happening. We don't know what has caused the arousal, the etiology of the arousal, causation. These authors suggested that regardless of whether a person was aware of the true cause of the arousal, they were still more attracted to the target person than those in the control condition. In other words, you had three groups basically. Two of the groups were aroused. One group didn't know why the arousal occurred, didn't know the source of the physiological arousal. One group knew the source they knew that the physiological arousal is because of exertion or exercise or injection of epinephrine or whatever. They knew the cause. And the third group were control. They were not aroused at all. So aroused without cause, aroused with cause, no arousal. And they discovered that both aroused groups, even the group that knew why they are being aroused, both groups misjudged attractiveness. Both groups were attracted to the target person, the Confederate woman or men. They were attracted, unusually so, and they mislabeled and misattributed their arousal to the attraction, even when they knew that it's not true. Even when they knew that the cause of the arousal is something completely different, they still tended to deceive themselves and to lie to themselves that they're being sexually aroused. I explained why earlier. Because there was a need to convert potentially threatening situation, catastrophizing situation into a pleasurable situation, a reward-centered situation, which would be anxiolytic, would reduce anxiety. So they came up with another model, new model, and they call it the response facilitation model. The response facilitation model states that it is possible that people could be aware of the true cause of arousal and still find themselves misattributing, still find themselves attracted to someone compared to people who are unaroused and still lie to themselves that this concocted attraction is the reason that they are aroused, even though they know better, even though they know it's not true. This demonstrates another potential model that could explain the attraction-arousal component of the misattribution of arousal theory. So, coming back full circle, next time you're sexually aroused, ask yourself, have I done anything to change my physiological parameters? Have I just been exercising or exerting myself, or do I have an underlying medical condition? So, when you're sexually aroused, question the reasons for your arousal. Ask yourself as well, am I anxious about something? Am I catastrophizing something? Am I worried and concerned about something? And then there's some chance, and it's not a small chance, that you're converting negative effects, catastrophizing, anxiety, and physiological signals from the body which appear to be threatening. You're converting all these into something more pleasurable and rewarding, like sexual anxiety. But that's a misattribution. You're deceiving yourself. You're lying to yourself. Anxiety can be misidentified as sexual arousal and eroticized in order to camouflage and disguise the ominous, menacing undertones and overtones of the real cause. Remember that. Remember also that sexual arousal can create anxiety. So next time you're sexually aroused, you're attracted to someone romantically or physically, and immediately you're flooded with anxiety, it's because you're misidentifying the arousal as anxiety. The anxiety is not real. It's not performance anxiety. It's simply the constant association of sexual arousal and anxiety going the wrong way, going the other way. Do not use sex to reduce your anxiety. If you make sex your preferred anxiety medication, if you self-medicate with sex in order to reduce your anxiety and depression, your sexual behavior and romantic behavior would become stalkish, compulsive, creepy, threatening, unpleasant, and could get you in hot waters, in trouble if you overdo it. Remember, the gender roles are intimately connected with sex, sexuality, and they're as equally intimately connected with anxiety. Don't overplay your masculinity or femininity because it might induce anxiety. Always ask yourself, what is really happening there? Stand back. Think for a minute. What is really happening there? And only if you believe that you got the answer straight, 100%, go for it. Especially if the other party is truly attractive. Happy arousal.